Have you ever spent more time fighting clumpy paint than actually painting? Well, my friend, that's because you're missing out on the most important hobby tool you didn't know you needed, the wet palette. Today, we're diving in, teaching you everything you need to know to make your paints last longer, blend smoother, and teach you everything about leveling up your paint game by using a wet palette. Let's do this. Okay, let's talk about one of the biggest struggles we as miniature and warhammer painters have: drying paints. You put some paint on your palette and halfway through adding your first coat, your paint has turned into a thick, unusable mess. Sound familiar? That is where the wet palette comes in. Instead of grabbing paint directly from the paint pot or from a plastic surface, or the horrible Games Workshop silicone servo skull, think of the wet palette as a moisture control system. The sponge holds the water which slowly seeps through the wet palette paper, preventing your paint from drying too fast. But here is the magic part. If you do things right, it doesn't make your paint too wet either. It keeps the paint at a perfect consistency for hours for smooth application and blending. This means that you get more working time for all of your different paint blends. Your blends stays consistent, and the best of all, you waste less paint. So whether you're working on a single miniature for a Golden Demon entry or you're working on a full freaking army, the wet palette is your best friend. On top of that, using a wet palette will help you load your brush to get much finer control of your application on the miniature. And using a wet palette to load my brush is definitely one of those things that helped me improve my skills as a miniature painter way faster than pretty much 99% of all the other tools out there. Trust me, once you try a wet palette, you'll never go back. So let's start from the beginning. What do you actually need to get started with the wet palette? Well, there are already some existing brands out there that you can grab from your local hobby store, and most of them work fine. But personally, I have a clear favorite, and this is a brand that I used way before I started this YouTube channel, and that is Redgrass Games and their everlasting wet palettes. And this is also the brand that we've worked with to make our own wet palette. More on that later. But there are also other brands that work perfectly fine, such as this one from Army Painter, this one from Mindwork Games, or the ones from Game Envy. There are reasons why we prefer these ones over a homemade one. They come ready to use, are well designed, sponges are mold resistant, and most importantly, the papers are specifically used for miniature painters and the hobby acrylics that comes with that. But here's the thing, if you're just starting out, I usually don't recommend buying a professional wet palette the first thing you do, because there are so many other things that you need to spend money on to get your hobby essentials up to a good level. It is better that you spend those extra dollars on maybe a few extra paints or a Kolinsky paintbrush before grabbing the professional wet palette. Because a homemade wet palette is one of the easiest DIY things you can do at home without having to spend a ton of money. And it can still do you good for a couple of months until you've built up your hobby toolkit. And once you've done that, the Squidmar wet palette will still be around and ready waiting for you once you're at that point. As long as you have parchment paper, not the waxy kind, and some kind of sponge that holds your water, you are good to go. And with that, let's talk about the best way of making a homemade wet palette. If you've looked up DIY wet palettes before, you've probably seen a ton of different versions of it. People using different sponges, or heck, even just stacking paper towels. And technically, I guess it works, but it's not gonna be nearly as good as it can be with just homemade items that you have at home. The thing is, it is just not nearly as good as using Swedish dish rags or Vetex dish rags. As a Swede, everyone have these at home. But if you don't live in Sweden, I am going to link these down below to Amazon so you can pick them up and make yours at home as well. And there are many things that make these better than everything else out there. Firstly, they hold water better than any other sponge I've seen. They grow to like 4 times their size once you fill them with water, and they hold that water perfectly for days. Secondly, these ones have some form of anti-mold treatment, which makes them last a lot longer without getting moldy. Heck, these even outperform a lot of the specially made sponges for wet palettes for hobby tools you see out there. Especially if you can find the white ones without the print on them. That way you won't be distracted by any of the color underneath or the patterns underneath your parchment paper either. When it comes to parchment paper, you just want the classic parchment paper. This one is brown, but it's even better if you can find the white one that is a little bit more neutral in its color. It is important, however, that you don't buy the wax paper, because the wax paper does not let through enough moist through the paper. For container, I like using just a regular Tupperware or a plastic container that I've had for my leftovers. I normally use the lid of said container because it has a very low edge, which makes it easy to grab the paint from the palette. The container itself then becomes the lid of the wet palette. So once you cut your sponge so it fits with the size of your lid, fill the sponge with water, you cut out a perfect piece of parchment paper, bada bing bada boom, you have a perfect homemade wet palette. And while I get some paint in on some minis using this wet palette, let's talk about this week's sponsor, Squarespace.
Throughout the years, we've gotten to know you guys as our viewers, and I know that probably like 80% of you are creatives, meaning that maybe you have a side hustle where you do something creative, maybe you have a commission service where you paint miniatures, or some other type of business that you want to showcase online. These days, we're kind of going into post-social media times, which means that you need to have a platform outside of social media that is your own, where you showcase the thing that you want to sell. And thanks to Squarespace, this week's sponsor, it's never been easier. They have decades worth of experience, and now they're combining that together with artificial intelligence and have built out something that they call design intelligence, giving you award-winning templates to work from and then holding your hand throughout that process to make that website unique and truly yours. So if you want to showcase your thing, seem like a professional online and really showcase that service that you want to make your full-time living at some point, go follow the link down in the video description or head to squarespace.com. It's completely free to try out for 30 days. And once you've built that beautiful website and you want to launch it, you can use the code Squidmar at checkout and you'll get 10% off your entire purchase of the first website or domain that you're launching. You're not gonna regret it. We have not. We designed our website with it and it's definitely worth it. So go check it out. Now let's head back to wet palettes.
Some of you now might ask, how much water do I actually add to the wet palette? Well, that depends on where you live. If you live in a dry place, like we do up in northern Sweden, or maybe in a Nevadan desert, you're gonna need a lot of water. We usually fill up our wet palettes so that the sponge is floating in water and still it dries out in a matter of hours. But if you live in a more humid place, like say the UK or South America, you actually want less water, because too much water and your paints might actually be too diluted for your painting sessions, which makes making layers and highlights a true nightmare. So depending on your climate, you might want to experiment a little bit to find that sweet spot. And if you feel like you have too much water or not enough of water, well, you know what to do. But now let's move on to talk about something that none of us actually want to talk about, and that is mold. Have you ever opened your wet palettes after it's been sealed for a couple of days and been greeted by a small science experiment? You're not alone. The number one tip to avoid getting mold is simply do not fully seal tightly your lid for too long. If I'm just leaving my wet palette for a little while, I can do that, but mostly I leave a small opening so that the palette can breathe properly. And if I know that I'm not painting for a couple of days, I just leave the wet palette box without putting the lid there at all, letting the sponge fully dry out. With the lid off, it just naturally evaporates all the water in there and it keeps the sponge fresh for much longer. And if you're using the same palette as we do, don't get afraid if your sponge ends up looking like this, sponge mountain. You can just add water back into this when you're ready to start painting again. If that's a week or a couple of days, doesn't matter. You can do this however many times as you want, the sponge isn't going to get bad. On the contrary, it's actually going to make your sponge last a lot longer. But as I said, if I'm just stepping away for 30 minutes or a couple of hours, it is perfectly fine to use the lid. However, if I know that I'm away for longer than that, I'd much rather have to refill the water into it than having to find a bunch of mold in here. The main purpose of the wet palette is not to keep a drop of paint perfectly usable for many days in a row and keep it wet for weeks. It is to keep the paint of drop perfect during the time you're painting. Since both the Swedish dish rags and the Redgrass Games foams are treated with some mold resistant thing, they tend to last you a little bit longer, but if you keep them perfectly sealed with bacteria in there, sooner or later you are going to have mold growing even on these ones. So it's still a good idea to let them dry out instead of leaving them for too long to keep things fresh and avoid funky smells starting to grow in your wet palette. If your sponges grow sour, you can wash these in a washing machine on 60 degrees Celsius or even boil them to kill bacteria in there. However, this has a tendency to change the composition of the material, and over time it can destroy your sponges. We haven't done long extensive tests of this, so I can't tell you how many washes you can do or for how long. It is not very costly to just replace these if things go bad. Do make sure to not wash them in a dishwasher, because you don't want any food leftovers to seep into this. That is a recipe for disaster. Also, while we're on the topic of things to avoid, let's talk about metallic paints and inks. Metallic paints have a tendency of breaking down super quickly on wet palettes. The metallic flakes and pigments tend to separate super fast, and you end up with this thin, weird paint that doesn't behave like it's supposed to do. I honestly just recommend using a dry palette when painting with metallic paints. Inks and contrast paints and washes is also a tricky one, because these paints are so thin and often with a chemical composition that has a very low surface tension that they tend to break down and seep through the palette paper and stain the sponges underneath. It's not the end of the world, but you'll waste a ton of product, and your palette can get kind of gross quickly. Sometimes, of course, I add the paints to the palette anyway. It's not a thing that you'll die from doing, but it's also great to get an understanding for how different products interact with another. So now, if you add a wash or contrast paint to your wet palette, it's not a mistake that you're doing. You understand why it's not easy to use anymore. So now that you've got your wet palette set up, you understand how not to use it. Let's talk about how to get the most from your wet palette. Let's start with loading your brush. One of the absolute biggest benefits of using a wet palette that we haven't covered the slightest so far in this video is that it helps you control the amount of paint in your brush. You don't want to just dunk the paintbrush into the paint and slap it directly on the miniature. No. Instead, what you want to do is make sure that the bristles of your brush is slightly moistened. Depending then on how much paint you dip into your brush controls how thick the application on the miniature is going to be. But before we start applying it, we stir it properly into the belly of the brush so that it really fills up the bristles fully. I then slowly spin my brush backwards on the palette to make sure that I have a nice tip of the brush and that I have a good amount of paint released from it before I start applying it to the miniature. This lets the brush naturally load a controlled amount of paints into the belly of the brush. And it also helps me confirm that I have a good balance between moisture and paint in the brush before I start applying it to the miniature, making the paints glide perfectly on the miniature with every stroke. And then I can use the brush until I start feeling that I get a bad release of paint from the brush, or I see that the bristles start splaying. When that happens, it is time to re-moisten the brush and go at it again, refilling it on the wet palette. And remember, the palette isn't just a storage surface, it is actually a working surface. You can mix paints there directly on the palette. And pre-mixing your paints on the palette is one of the best ways to create a consistent tone over a miniature project or an army. Let's say you're doing a blue cloak and you want a shadow, a midtone and a highlight. Instead of mixing them separately every time you want to mix them to create blends, hoping you'll be able to match the previous miniature, you can pre-mix an existing line of colors with a perfect gradient directly on your wet palette and just move your brush between them and the miniature as you go. And the moisture in between will keep these mixes of paints perfectly moist during your painting session. So even if you're working on one part and then going back half an hour later to that part, your blend will still be perfect and ready waiting for you. This helps massively when blending, because when the paint stays workable longer, you can slowly work back and forth between shades without rushing, to create those kind of smooth blends that maybe can feel quite daunting when you're getting started. It is going to feel a lot more comfortable with a wet palette. The key thing here is to think of your wet palette as your paint station, your workstation, not just a place to put your blobs of paint. You can thin, mix and glaze and even test your consistency of paints directly on the wet palette. But how often do you need to change the paint on your palette? Yes, your wet palette keeps your paint fresh for a longer time. But that doesn't mean that it lasts forever. Eventually your paint will either start to dry, start to separate, or you'll notice the paint starting getting shocked when you add it to your miniature. Or maybe the paints just get overly thinned down from too much moisture seeping through. That will especially be the case if you're using parchment paper at home. When that happens, the best thing that you can do is firstly check that your wet palette is still moist. The second one is just to add a new fresh drop of paint. Seriously, it is not worth struggling with bad paint. A single drop of paint costs you way less than 10 cents, so just adding a new fresh drop instead of going back and forth trying to struggle with that already dried or overly watered down paint can save you a lot of time, frustration, and potential cleanup if you end up ruining a detail because of bad paint. I've seen so many painters, myself included, trying to stretch a drop of paint for as long as humanly possible. You're sitting there adding more water, trying to keep the paint alive, mixing it back together, thinning it, whispering prayers to the chaos gods, when you could have just added a new drop of paint. Don't overthink, just add a new drop of paint when you feel like it's done its job. Fresh paint performs better, covers better, and blends much better. The wet palette gives you more mileage, absolutely, but once the paint starts going home, just reload it. Your minis will thank you, and you yourself will thank you for it. And now let's talk about some upsides of the wet palette that we're using ourselves, and why we keep coming back to that as opposed to using the homemade wet palette that we made earlier in this video. One of our favorite features of the more expensive wet palettes, especially the one that is designed by Redgrass Games, is the reusable wet palette membranes, meaning the papers. This membrane can be cleaned after your painting session. Heck, even if you forget it overnight and it dries up, you can re-clean it the day after under running water. Realistically, we can get at least 15 uses from a reusable membrane without any issue. That is not only more sustainable, but also super convenient, especially if you paint regularly. An interesting tidbit as well with this paper as opposed to the paper that you get with Army Painter or the old Redgrass Games wet palette that they had on their version 1 wet palettes. We just hired an editor called Kristoffer. When he started working here, we gave him a cheap wet palette that we had left over in the office, so he could paint at home. Then we had a painting session here in the office and he got to play with the Squidmar wet palette paper that is in the Redgrass Games wet palettes as well. And just at his first use, he was so surprised with how much easier the surface is to work with on the Redgrass Games membrane. The paper is a little bit more firm and has a bit more even seep-through of moisture through the membrane than the old papers had. And he just found it way easier to work with when you don't have an oversaturation of water seeping into the paint, giving him as a beginner a much easier time. Now, full transparency, here in the office, I change my papers probably every 3-4 times when I paint. but that is mostly because I want the papers to look fresh for the painting videos and the painting tutorials that we do. And the same thing goes for the sponges. These, if they don't get moldy, you can reuse them for years without having to clean them or replace them. However, I change these maybe once every 3-4 months just because I want them to look fresh in videos. This specific one I've used for about 2.5-3 months now, and you can see that it still looks really fresh. And that is because I let it dry out after each session when I don't use it 2 days in a row. With that said, after a few more months of use, the sponges are going to start to look grimy because you have paints seeping through on the edges when you've added too much paint, or you forgot the paint on there wet for a too long time. That is totally fine, but it's also sometimes difficult to know if it's just black paint on the edges or if it's mold in there, because sometimes it does look like mold, even though it's probably just leaked paint on that edge. So even if we quite often change out the sponge and the paper, it is purely for aesthetics. The truth is, this setup is very proficient, reliable and low maintenance, and lasts for a very long time, which in long term makes it a cheap setup, even though the initial investment is about 50 euros. And hey, if you want to check out our wet palette, we just re-released it after the first one sold out in less than 2 months. This time we have a brand new spanking artwork that just looks freaking amazing, with orcs and goblins just going ham, designed by the incredibly talented Emir Durmisevic. It uses the XL shape of the Redgrass Games wet palette and the version 2 of the sponges and the membranes, so they are the reusable and the thicker ones that give you a little bit more working time before it dries out. It is honestly the wet palette that we use every day in the studio and have been doing since before we started this YouTube channel. And yeah, it is the most beautiful looking wet palette on the market. If you want to check it out, I will leave the link down in the video description. Go grab it now while stock lasts.
Hey everyone, it's Emil from the future now, and this video was supposed to come out like 5 months ago, but a lot of you already know that we had some issues with the American customs and we wanted to release it worldwide at the same time. And this morning, today, I got a message that it has finally been let through the American customs, which means that we are ready for a release. But with the caveat that it might take a couple of more weeks for Americans to get the shipments. You can still buy it now, but the shipments will take a little bit longer just because we need to prep everything at the warehouse. They need to get everything sorted and up and ready. But now we at least know that it's released from the customs. So thankfully, everyone now can get it everywhere. Just be patient with the shipping time if you order from our US web store that just went live now, as of like right now.
Huge thanks to this week's sponsor, Squarespace. And of course, to all of our amazing patrons. Without you guys, we would not be able to do this full time. Especially thanks to our top donors. You guys are boats and goats. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. Peace out.